doing this by Zoom as well, because we had a couple council members that were having to quarantine because either they were attending to someone that needed to quarantine or they themselves had to quarantine. So in order to have them be able to participate, we've opened this up to the public to be able to Zoom in as well. But we have not tried to do this before, have this kind of a hybrid meeting. So expect some excitement. As I was saying, we had a sufficient number of people petition to have essentially this legislation put on hold. All right, they got enough signatures together to challenge it, to force the question under our ordinance, under our charter rather, to either trash the legislation or send it to the ballot. And we're required by the charter of Gulf Manor to have a public hearing to hear from folks who've showed up here, the folks that have showed up on Zoom as to whether we should refer it to the ballot or whether we should just trash it. So process-wise, how we're going to do this is first I'm going to ask for some comments from our solicitor, our legal attorney here, to talk about the history of this ordinance and essentially what it says. I've also asked that he comment on some recent Supreme Court decisions that have been made that may be relevant to the ordinance that we have. Following that, I will ask for public comment. We're going to do the live comments first and then the Zoom ones next. And I'm going to ask for two categories to keep it simple. I'm going to ask the folks who would prefer that the legislation, what's the word for it? Not referred, but repealed. The folks that would like the legislation repealed to speak first. We'd ask that you maintain your social distance. I have a list of cards here of people that have been registered to speak, so I'll call names. And if you would indicate if you're in favor of repealing it, I would ask you to step forward, not to touch the microphone, please, but to speak into the microphone. And we'll go through the list. If you are not interested in repealing it, I'll set your card aside. And as soon as we're done with all the folks that want to speak to repealing it, I'll ask for the people to speak that want to speak to referring it to the ballot. All right. Doing it this way enables us to more easily have one of you stand up and just say, I agree with what he said. All right. You do have 3 minutes to speak. We'd ask that you stick strictly to that 3 minutes. When we have completed the live comments, I'm going to do the same process with the folks on Zoom. So we don't have to be going on Zoom, off Zoom, on Zoom, off Zoom, back and forth. So then we'll do the comments that way too. We have it set up so that those comments will be heard through our speakers here. All right. And then following that, when there's no more comments, we'll have discussion among our committee members here who are all members of our council. All right. And what they need to determine is whether they are going to make the recommendation to our full council, which is themselves, whether to repeal it or refer it to the ballot. All right. But we will have to close the committee meeting, open up a council meeting to officially do that. We'll need to do roll call again at that time. And then we'll have a vote to officially determine whether it's going to the ballot or whether it's just repealed. All right. Am I forgetting anything? All right. So procedure-wise, I'm going to turn it over to our solicitor, Mr. Terry Donnellan here, to give a little bit of history on the legislation, what it says, and then also how the Supreme Court decisions recently have affected it.
Before we get too far into the process, do we have people able to speak to us yet through Zoom?
Yes, we do.
Okay, and they're able to hear us? They can give a thumbs up right now that they're hearing us?
Yes, they've
right.
confirmed that they can hear.
I may need to move away from the speaker here to stop the feedback. Is that better? Yeah. Much better. Again, the mayor asked me in preparation for this to kind of give a history, a summary of where we started, what we've been through, and then address these two recent cases. The process for this ordinance began actually in 2018. At that time, I was asked to begin the process to draft an ordinance to combat discrimination. The purpose of the ordinance was to recognize the LGBTQ plus community as a protected class with the same civil rights protections for age, gender, race, ethnicity. Those things were commonly referred to in our civil rights laws. The LGBTQ plus community is not recognized as a protected class at either state or federal level. The secondary purpose of the ordinance was to establish a process to address complaints just within the village of Gulf Manor. When I first met with council leadership, we discussed this issue. I advised that we should not create a commission to investigate complaints beyond just looking at investigating complaints and reconciling complaints. That, like other ordinances around the state of Ohio, we should not be creating a commission here in Gulf Manor that would have the ability to award civil damages, hundreds of thousands of dollars. We should not create a commission that would be a component of a criminal charge. We continue to use the term, we need to Gulf Manor size what we're doing. So in creating the ordinance, we started with that first step with the opportunity to file a complaint, the commission vetting the complaint. If the commission found that there was no basis for the complaint, that either this was protected activity by an employer, by a resident, by a business, we would have to dismiss the complaint at the outset. The complainant would have another 30 days within which to bring forward additional evidence if they felt it was appropriate. At that point in time, we would then reach out to the respondent to get their comments. And then the first step in our process, which we created in the ordinance, was attempt a conciliation. See if we can talk to both sides and find an equitable resolution. And if not, we would even invoke mediation. We talked about trying to create a bank of mediators who would either volunteer their time or would mediate this process at a very low fee. So when a complaint is filed, again, the commission as it's constituted right now would review it, perhaps dismiss it, or move it forward in the process. Again, not going to full investigation, nor determining it's some kind of civil penalty. We do have a civil penalty up to $1,000, but we would first try to find a solution to the problem. Drafts of this ordinance, when we started in November 2018, were shared throughout the process with both rabbinical community through Rabbi Matzin and with Equality Ohio. Looking back at our history, we had revisions in March of 2019, June of 2019, September of 2019, and November of 2019. Along the way in the fall of 2019, it was recommended that Gulf Manor look at the Medina ordinance, which had passed up in Medina, Ohio, which had a number of exemptions recognized in each of the 4 protected classes. The 4 protected classes being housing, employment, education, and public accommodation. So we went through multiple hearings in the fall and in early 2020 to go through those various amendments, sometimes just focusing upon a proposed amendment for the entire meeting itself and trying to nuance language and definitions to get Is that okay?
We have new members joining
Okay.
the Zoom feed.
So in any event, we went through that process, and then the ordinance went through 3 readings before it became effective in January of 2020. Again, the 4 areas of protection kind of mirror protections recognized under federal law for other groups. And our ordinance is not strictly focused upon the LGBTQ plus community. We do talk about race. We do talk about age. We do talk about other protected classes, giving people an alternative to come here versus starting on a path with litigation. And to give you an idea of how we crafted out some of those protections, we recognize that educational institutions, religious institutions are permitted to restrict admission of students to those who attend the same faith. They're permitted to operate same-sex educational institutions. Public accommodations, religious organization may limit the offering of goods or services and facilities, including contiguous facilities, to persons of the same religion, and nothing prevents them from giving preference to such persons, providing if the offering of goods or services are offered for a commercial purpose, so out into the general stream of commerce, then we felt they would be bound by our rules, our restrictions, or if somehow we were providing funding for that particular event. One of the most hotly debated sections of our ordinance, and those who attended any of our meetings would know this, we went round and round on the issue of employment discrimination. We had general exceptions were recognized in favor of religious institutions employing persons to perform work connected with carrying on that religious or denominational corporation's purposes. Further protections were recognized when employing persons to positions involving the religious functions or activities of the institution. Now, in the last 2 weeks, you may have seen through the news that the Supreme Court ruled in a case Bostock, I'm not sure if it's Bostock or Bostock, but the Supreme Court took the step to recognize and under Title VII of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression are now recognized as protected employment classes. The court went to great lengths to talk about that there was not before them at that time other areas that could be discrimination complaints, housing, accommodation. In fact, what the court said was, we're not going to address whether or not, in this case, the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and the First Amendment trumps what we're deciding today in Bostock. The court kind of wink, wink said, we assume something like that will be coming down the pike very soon. Well, last week it did. In the case of Our Lady of Guadalupe, what the court decided was what we call the ministerial exemption, and the court reaffirmed that when it comes to positions of employment that involve the management or the advocacy of a particular faith, that those positions of employment are absolutely protected. The court even cut a little broader path because the case before them did not involve sexual orientation. It actually involved a complaint for age discrimination and another complaint for ADA discrimination. And what the court said was when it's an employment decision relative to a religious institution, that religious institution trumps. It trumps it. So that the court says that basically that Title VII will not apply in those particular positions with religious institutions. What was interesting though is one comment from the court case. The court said this does not mean that religious institutions enjoy a general immunity from secular laws, but it does protect their autonomy with respect to internal management decisions that are essential to the institution's central mission. What the court basically has told us is it depends on what you're doing, not who you are. And what you're doing will be the crux upon which the court will determine an exemption. This is, by the way, identical to what we have in our ordinance relative to the exemption for employment in educational institutions. So the Supreme Court's already ahead of us with that exemption. The Supreme Court has now recognized it. But in closing, I want to point out for those of you who have not read the text, it's a very long text. I know some of you have, some of you have heard what it says, but there's a general exemption at the end. And that general exemption basically says that we have to follow constitutional law. What that means is as constitutional law evolves, we have no choice, but we must follow that as well. So if the Supreme Court starts to extend these protections, we follow that. If the Supreme Court decides that there should be certain exemptions to protections, we have to follow that as well. So one of the questions that has been asked of me many times in the last few weeks, does this case, the Bostock case, take away the need for the ordinance? And what I pointed out is the Bostock case dealt with educational institutions and employment decisions within educational institutions. It did not address, as the court said, public accommodation. It did not address housing. So while the court may have addressed one prong of protected class and one prong of an exemption, the court did not touch the other three areas of our ordinance that are still in place.
Thank you, Mr. Donnellan. And thank you. And thank you again to everyone for coming out on this day. I see that a number of people have recently been seated since I first started, so I'm going to review some of the rules that we had to be able to do this publicly. We've asked that you maintain a 6-foot social distance. If when seated, that you wear a mask while you're moving around and unable to maintain a social distance. That once you are seated in a socially distant, at a social distance from someone who is not, that you're not living with already, that you are able to remove your mask at that time, if that's what you desire to do. Otherwise, when you are getting up to approach the microphone, please have your mask on. You can remove it when speaking at the microphone. We ask that you not touch the microphone. We do have an ordinance in Gulf Manor to support the mask mandate, so we can't enforce that here. As far as process goes, we're going to be asking for folks who wish to speak to repeal the ordinance to go first. I've noticed that some people are holding their cards. If you would, if we may have a volunteer perhaps that can collect any remaining cards to bring them up here so I can begin calling names. Okay, all right. I'm also being advised that part of our process as you're entering is to sign a health check. Under the mandate, when we're in buildings, we have people take a temperature as they are entering the building to ensure that we're catching folks that may be symptomatic that way. When we're outside, we found it's very difficult to take temperature in the sun and have it be accurate. So we've asked that you sign a piece of paper. If you have not done that, please raise your hand. We can bring that piece of paper to you, or approach the desk over here. Basically, we ask you to testify that you don't have a temperature, that you're not caring for someone who's quarantined, a couple other things that kind of get at that point. Try to make sure we're not spreading anything here. I'm going to ask the 3 petitioners to speak first. And I'm going to see if you're here first. Marilyn Horowitz.
She is actually on Zoom.
On Zoom.
I believe.
Stuart.
She is.
And I apologize if I am. And Alan. Thank you. Yes. Yes. So we have 2 here in person and 1 on Zoom. And I would ask, do you want to go first? Do you have anything to? On behalf? All right. On behalf of all 3 of you? All right.
I'll do that then.
After all the comments?
Why don't we do that now, since they're the ones that are bringing it? Them speak, you speak on their behalf.
It would speak to why we're here. It makes sense to go first.
Or does the person who's on Zoom prefer to speak?
Or does the person on Zoom prefer to speak instead?
I don't think that was good.
Okay.
Should I take off my
Just don't touch the microphone, please.
my best? A.D. Mutson, 2179 Bluegrass Lane, former resident of Gulf Manor, and here representing both those petitioners. So we've heard the solicitor and others ask if the recent Supreme Court decision in Bostock and the Lady of Guadalupe decisions make the issue moot for the religious organizations, for those, the committee who are presenting this petition for referendum. And the simple answer is no. If anything, the decision makes the ordinance itself less necessary and a broader religious accommodation more appropriate. There are 2 groups of employers not covered by the Bostock decision: small companies and religious organizations. Companies of 15 and above go to the EEOC. 4 and below are excluded from the ordinance. So that leaves many of the religious organizations exposed. In Justice Alito's dissent, he goes further and warns that the court's position here threatens freedom of religion. And even though the court agreed with the Catholic schools in that case that you mentioned, the teachers over there provided religious instructions, and the court said that they could be considered ministers, but it did not address other very visible school employees who may not qualify for the ministerial exception. As we said repeatedly throughout this process, we were not coming here to ask for the ministerial exception to be written in code. That the Constitution does for us and the court interprets. We have said repeatedly that all people deserve love, dignity, and respect. We oppose unjust acts of discrimination, but we can't deny that there are areas of life where the civil rights claimed by some conflict with the religious freedom of others. And that's what we were trying to balance. The ordinance, however, limits a religious institution from deciding who to hire to carry out its mission, potentially turns houses of worship and religious schools into public accommodations, subject to new restrictions on their ability to operate. And the religious exemption for the public accommodation is entirely inadequate, as we said in the past. The solicitor mentioned that there's a maximum $1,000 fine. The penalty, according to the ordinance, says that each violation is $500 a day. So if a dispute took a year to adjudicate, looks like it would be about a fine of $180,000 if that's how long it took. I'm going to wrap up and let others speak for themselves, but you're going to hear a lot of things today. And one side may say that repealing the ordinance will be taking away the rights of some residents of the village and make it less welcoming. But that would be disingenuous and ignoring the hours of testimony and actual experiences of the residents of the village for those who were here during those many months can attest to that. Members of the LGBT community have served and continue to serve in prominent positions on council with an excellent relationship with the residents. At the hearings, not only did we not hear of incidents of discrimination in the village, we heard just the opposite. So if anybody tries to portray the Gulf Manor as anything but a welcoming village, they are misrepresenting the truth, and that shouldn't be tolerated by any residents of the village. And with that, I will let others comment on their position. And on behalf of the committee, we went forward with the petition because that was the only avenue left for a petition for referendum. But really, this needs to be revisited, take a step back and repeal, and we will join you and work with you to come up with a common ground that can work for all residents of the village. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Munson. All right, the way I'm going to proceed is I'm going to read your name. I'm going to do the best that I can to pronounce it correctly. And if you would like to come forward and speak on the position of repealing the legislation, please just raise your hand and come forward. If not, just raise your hand and indicate that you want to speak next when we're talking about referring it to the ballot. All right, because I'll set that card aside and I'll come back to them. So the first card that I have is Monica Lira. Thank you. Hi. Maybe I can bring you a microphone here. Very good. Jen Scott. Emily Meyer. John Mallett. Okay. Thank you.
John Mallett, 2539 Los Santoville Avenue, Cincinnati, Ohio. Been a resident of Gulf Manor for about 16 years. Also, the heck?
I apologize.
Also own a few properties in Gulf Manor, and I'm aware of the ordinance, and I think it needs to be repealed. I think that there's a lot of conflict in that, and we just need to sit back, like Rabbi Munson said, and just revisit it. And again, I think we ought to look at the city of Cincinnati's ordinance that they adopted, where they exempted the religious churches, and follow that lead. We shouldn't be any different. It works for Cincinnati. We should have it here. And I think that would work, and everybody be happy and all that. And I agree with Rabbi Munson that nobody should be discriminated against, and Gulf Manor is a welcoming community. We've got a lot of good residents here for a long time. Most of them have been here for long periods of time, and so we just need to repeal this and redo it. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. Elaine Motzkovitz. Maxine Robinson.
Hi, I've been a resident of Golf Manor. I live at 2441 Ardmore Avenue, and I've been a resident, homeowner of Golf Manor for 20 years. And Golf Manor is a welcoming community. And being an African-American descendant of slaves, just looking over my life and time, I'm thinking of that other fabric of protection, because we have so much protection here in Golf Manor. So my thing is, why have another ordinance? You know, with me being an African American, I don't have an additional ordinance, even though we have the civil rights Title 7, but still, I go through the same discrimination things. I can walk out my house and go through the same types of things, but I know I have law and order, and I love my police department. So in that regards, I'll say repeal. Let's just take a step back and take a look at everything.
Thank you, Ms. Robinson. AD, I had a card for you.
Oh, wait, actually, I told you I was gonna.
Very good. Yes.
I am just handing in a written letter for the record.
Why don't you go ahead and read it, Mr. Allen? So a letter has been submitted by someone who could not be here in person.
And I apologize. Is it Tehila?
Yeah.
Tehila High, 2502 Vera Avenue, Apartment 4. Like many residents, I was concerned that the non-discrimination ordinance didn't adequately protect religious organizations. I am also worried that a referendum will defeat the very goal of the ordinance, which was to make Golf Manor a more inclusive and welcoming place. I have personally been the target of baseless claims made against those who supported the referendum. In a letter to the Board of Elections, Ms. Elaine Moskovitz made claims questioning the circulators and many of the signatures. I have the distinction of appearing twice in her letter. On page 6, she claims that Tehila High is not a registered voter at my address. I just have to ask you, Rabbi, this has to do with the validity of the petition. It's not before us.
No, but it's her perspective on why
Okay.
did not go to referendum.
I'll allow it. I'll go ahead and just
She
say read it.
claims that Tehila High is not a registered voter at my address, but she admits that the records show Tehila Spetner and Yitzhak High, leaving aside her false assumption that I had to be a registered voter in order to circulate a petition. One doesn't have to be an election expert to figure out that I recently got married and now use my new last name, but I'm still registered under my maiden name. Later on page 11, she falsely claims that my signature doesn't match either of the two people registered at the address, me and my husband. I don't bring these up to prove that Ms. Moskovitz didn't do a good job with her research, but if these are the kinds of patently false accusations that are being thrown at me now, I'm afraid to think what the referendum campaign will look like. If we're so far falsely accused of election fraud, what's next? My husband and I both grew up in Amberley and attended school in Golf Manor. We moved to Golf Manor, a welcoming place to live. I have enjoyed getting to know my neighbors. A referendum would just pit neighbor against neighbor. I ask the council take a step back and repeal this controversial ordinance. If you feel an ordinance is necessary, I'd ask that you find a more balanced way to do so, because that would show that everyone is truly welcome in Golf Manor.
And we'll enter the comments into the record. Lou Marks. Steve Simile. Zachary Michelson.
Zachary Michelson, 2345 Vera Avenue. I've been enjoying the company of my fellow Golf Manor residents for about 5 years now. And, you know, I kind of have 2 points. One, if a city like Cincinnati, which is, we said we needed a Golf Manor sized solution. The city of Cincinnati, which has greatly more issues to deal with than our peaceful little village here, was able to, with a general exemption, solve all of their issues and meet everyone's needs, why would that not work for us here? I think a general exemption would solve everyone's needs, where it can protect everyone's rights here in our village. And second, it is anecdotal evidence, which isn't always the best evidence, but it can sometimes be the most convincing. Often we hear that there is consensus amongst the LGBT community about this issue, that they agree that this is what they need. Myself, as a canvasser going to people's houses on this issue, came to a home of a gay couple together. One person refused to sign our petition. He said, you know, I would never support something that would discriminate against me. His partner, on the other hand, found that everyone deserves to live their life in the way they choose. If he wants to live his life with his partner, he has every right to do that, and we support that. But just like he has his rights, so do we. And he happily and willingly even tried to encourage his partner to sign this petition. Again, this is anecdotal evidence, which is not the best evidence as someone who works in data himself. I love data points, but often anecdotal evidence is the most convincing evidence. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Michelson. Ben Travis.
Good evening. My name is Ben Travis, and I'm the Executive Vice President and representing the Cincinnati Hebrew Day School, located right here around the corner at 2222 Los Santoville. As some of my predecessors mentioned before, when this ordinance was being drafted, we advocated for religious exemption similar to the exemption included in the ordinance that was passed by the city of Cincinnati, because we felt as the Gulf Manor ordinance was written, that it burdened our free exercise of religion and would have, as it's written, a profound effect on our ability to operate as an institution, details of which we discussed through the process, and I think beyond the scope of our discussion here today, but we can elaborate on that if necessary. We are one of the largest employers in the village, and many of our employees both work and live in the village. The ordinance, as said, affects employment and public accommodation laws. We were hopeful that the council could have come up with an ordinance that balanced religious and civil rights, as was expressed by some of my predecessors. We are fully supportive of protecting the rights of all classes of citizens in the village. This is not about not protecting anybody's rights. Unfortunately, again, the current version of the bill we feel does not do that. This does not necessarily protect our religious liberties. If the council chooses to step back and repeal the ordinance today, we are committed to working with the council to finding common ground and truly create a win-win situation in the village where everybody's rights are being protected and religious liberty is being protected at the same time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Rabbi Yosef Alt.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yosef Alt. I reside at 6690 Meadow Ridge Lane. I'm the rabbi of Gulf Manor Synagogue, the only house of worship in the village of Gulf Manor. I was hired 2 years ago as an effort for the synagogue to rebuild. And we've seen success and we're starting to gain momentum. And this ordinance concerns me very deeply because as a very, very small, tight-knit institution, if we would ever get caught in legislation and have to adjudicate, we probably would not be able to survive it financially. And even though it's true, there are many, many exemptions. I want to address a question I think is bothering a lot of people. There's so many exemptions, so many religious exemptions. What are you so worried about? What worries me is exactly as was stated earlier, there were so many times that the details of this ordinance had to be addressed. It's complicated. It's a complicated ordinance. We're a tiny little synagogue. We can't have a on-staff attorney to address all the nitty-gritty. And it's a headache that is very concerning for us. And it's a potential financial threat that could bankrupt our synagogue. And that's a real concern that I have. Further, the second point I want to make is regarding the nature of the village as a whole. I, as the rabbi of Gulf Manor Synagogue, am strongly advocating for the village of Gulf Manor. I want people to support the village of Gulf Manor. That's very important for me and for my position and for how I feel about the village. And I think that the meetings that we've seen from when this process began is very telling to the fact that we're creating unnecessary contention. That's how I feel about it. I feel like the village is peaceful. People get along. Why can't we just get along? That's my feeling. And continuing this process is going to increase the degree of contention. There have been a number of council meetings where I personally felt very uncomfortable because of comments that certain people made. That's how I felt. We don't need that. The village of Gulf Manor does not need any of this. And I feel strongly that we would be much better off without any of this. And that's why I strongly ask the council to consider the option of repealing the ordinance.
Thank you, Rabbi Youssef. Susan Ramsey. So what we're going to do now is continue to do the live versions, and for folks who wish to speak to referring it to the ballot. After we complete those, we'll do the Zoom, as I had indicated earlier. Steve Simile.
Steve Simile, 2626 Canterbury Avenue. My husband and I have lived here in the village for 17 years now. I think if anything, the comments that have been made this evening show that there are pretty much an equal number of people that come down on both sides of this issue. I'd also like to remind council that you guys spent a year working on this hand in hand with the Jewish community to get where we are now. Unfortunately, nobody's going to agree entirely. So that's why I feel that it makes sense to let the voters, the residents of Gulf Manor, decide how they feel about this. And so I would encourage you to let the voters decide. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Simile. Lou Marks.
Some may recognize me. I was on council and executive committee during the entire time of the NDO being developed. I am here to say that we need to move this forward to the ballot. I have no issue with somebody putting out a document to say it should be going to the ballot. I think we need to hear from all the residents of Gulf Manor. That's totally appropriate. But I also am, having grown up during the 50s and 60s, I'm very well aware of what some issues happen with discrimination. I saw it firsthand in Pleasant Ridge when I was growing up. And there are people that are not protected. Whoa, that was interesting. Huh? Sorry. I was like, oh, somebody's shooting me. Anyway, if you look at FBI records during the 2000s, they have seen a dramatic increase in violence against minorities. And certainly the Jewish community knows all about violence against their people. But they also have seen in the last 2 years an increase in violence against Latinos and the LGBTQ community. And the violence has become more targeted to be personal. So I don't need to go through all the intolerance of the world, but one thing I grew up with was with Dr. King, hearing him say, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. A few decades later, Princess Diana said something that was very, very important. She said that The greatest threat in the world today is intolerance. I don't know when we're going to stop intolerance. Everybody has an excuse for why they want to be intolerant of a certain class of people, a certain race of people, a certain religion, whatever they are. But it's time to draw an end to this. As I was coming up into this, I was a little angry with the rabbi about some of his positions, and he knows we didn't always agree, but you know, we agreed to disagree, and that's fine. I thought we came up with a very, very balanced ordinance. Not everybody sees it that way. I thought we did as good a job as we could do. What I think we need to focus on is that what's happening in 2020. What happened on March 25th has dramatically changed the United States. The focus on discrimination against injustice against minorities is now in laser focus. And I don't care who you are. I don't care whether it's women, LGBTQ, any religious organization, including Jewish community. We need to stop the intolerance. And people can make all the excuses they want, but it's time to end the intolerance. And we need to take a stand. And I will fight for this. If this goes to ballot and is defeated, I will fight for it to come back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. Elaine Moskovitz.
Mayor Densmore, village council members, solicitor, and the residents of Gulf Manor. Thank you for listening to all viewpoints. One of the silver linings of the COVID stay-at-home orders is that more folks are outside in their yards and eager to speak to their neighbors. I had conversations with many neighbors over the past month that would have not happened if it not for the stay-home recommendations. What I gleaned is that everyone wants what's best for their family and their children. They want their kids to grow up to be successful participants of the greater community. They want assurances that the local government is conducted fairly and equitably, regardless of special or corrupting financial influence. And they want their children to be successful when they venture out on their own, regardless of their school choice. When their children enter college and beyond the work world as adults, all parents want to think that they provided the experiences that help their children be as successful as possible. Research has shown in numerous studies that kids with diverse experiences have a range of cognitive and social benefits. Integration yields to higher problem-solving skills, increased creativity, and encourages critical thinking skills. This benefits all kids, including middle-class white kids, by exposing them to peers of different backgrounds. Generally, positive effects on integrative complexity were found when groups had racial and opinion minority members, and when members reported having racially diverse friends and classmates. The findings are discussed in the context of social psychology theories of minority influence and social policy implications. I've provided the research citations, but so as not to bore anyone, how do I know this? Because I lived it. I went to Huffersheim Hebrew Day School from kindergarten to the 3rd grade, then to Pleasant Ridge School, Schroeder, and Woodward. I know I was successful in college and in life because I learned how to get along with all types of folks at Schroeder and Woodward. I roomed with students from less diverse communities. I observed the poor life decisions they made because they came from sheltered families. In neighborhoods, housing, and urban policies have been key to curbing segregation. Having policies that don't allow special interest groups to circumvent fair housing laws is beneficial to the health and vitality of the neighborhood and all the residents of the neighborhood, including the children who cannot yet vote, but are relying on their parents to do the right thing, the unselfish thing, and vote for an equality ordinance which will provide the rich experiences all children need to succeed in life. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Moskovitz.
Thank you.
Monica Lira. Jen Scott. Jen Scott. before you get started. So you're noting that you're in favor of, okay, so we can enter that in the record.
Got it.
Jen Scott, 370 South 5th Street, Columbus, Ohio, Equality, Ohio. I just wanted to take this moment to thank council for all the work you did for the past 2 years, and Councilman Marks in creating this ordinance that walks the fine line of separation of religion and government. You balanced things, you heard from everybody, you did the work. All of you have read this ordinance, every word, probably multiple times, which I can't always say for our government leaders. So I appreciate that. And it's now time to let the voters make that choice. Just as you worked to make a Gulf Manor size ordinance, it's time to make an ordinance that's appropriate for 2020 and one that protects the LGBTQ community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. We also have someone that submitted a letter to be read into the record. Just one moment.
An email or a text.
I think it needs to be submitted by one of the folks that's here. If they're not online, might want to ask if someone wants to read it in the same way that this was. If, let's go ahead and read it now, and then I'll finish up with the 2 maybe 3 more.
This was an email that was sent in, looks like yesterday morning, from Andy Buchel, apologize, Buechel. Says, I'm writing you regarding the proposal on whether to repeal or allow a vote on the human rights ordinance passed by this council. As a resident of Gulf Manor, I strongly urge you to at least allow us to vote on this issue. One of the reasons I was proud to move to this community was its diversity and the respect it shows for all kinds of people. It would be heartbreaking to have that undone unilaterally. It is sad enough that the rights of myself and many of my neighbors are subject to revision at all, but hopefully we can then show that Gulf Manor is a community that stands for all its residents equally. Signed, Andy Buchel, 2415 St. Albans, Apartment 1.
Thank you. Emily Meyer.
Hi there. Emily Meyer, 6307 Montgomery Road. And I'm here tonight as a staff attorney with Equality Ohio, but also with my address just up the road in Pleasant Ridge. I'm also here as a neighbor and a frequent visitor to the village. And of course, with Equality Ohio, I'm here tonight in support of the non-discrimination ordinance and for referring it to the ballot. To start, I know I'm brief, and Senator Donnellan did such a, or Solicitor Donnellan did such a great job, but I just have a few points to add. To start, I do want to note, where we've started from. Council has been having these discussions for years, almost 2 years now, hosting and convening all of us to have a debate and to address the public's concerns. The public input has been with us at every step of the way. By my count, we have had, council has been gracious enough to host at least 6 hearings, in fact, on the very issue of debating various provisions in this ordinance. Now, I am an attorney, so I have been through this ordinance many times, including just this afternoon. And by my count, there are 7 exemptions for religious organizations and institutions throughout this ordinance. And exemptions meaning in various ways and contexts that religious organizations and institutions do not have to comply with the non-discrimination provisions in the ordinance. There is 1 exemption in the housing section, 2 exemptions for religious organizations in employment, 1 exemption in the public accommodation section, 2 exemptions in the educational institutions section, and then just a 7th exemption in the general catch-all at the end of the ordinance that mentions, generally everyone has to be protected by the First Amendment under the Constitution. So we at Equality Ohio believe that these 7 exemptions craft over the years, this year and a half, over a year and a half, to address the concerns of the religious community in Gulf Manor, to be a very good and sufficient compromise with the many citizens, many of whom are here today of Gulf Manor, who want to see their community be inclusive and welcoming for all. And then just additionally, again, Solicitor Donnellan did a very bang up job here tonight to give a very concise summary of both the Bostock and the Our Lady of Guadalupe cases. And Rabbi Matzen mentioned Justice Alito. Justice Alito, one of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court, was in the dissent in the first case, the Bostock case that came out about 4 weeks ago or so. And he was super concerned in mentioning in his dissent the importance of protecting religious rights and the free exercise under our First Amendment. Fast forward a few weeks, Alito wrote the majority opinion in the Our Lady of Guadalupe case, which of course reaffirmed the ministerial exception in matters of employment that was first pronounced by the court in 2012. And not only did it reaffirm that exemption in matters of employment, but it even arguably it broadened it a bit by ensuring and stating in Alito's decision that it is not a rigid framework, that they provide factors to be addressed, but even sometimes not all factors are important and other factors can come into play as well. Additionally, the Our Lady of Guadalupe case applied not just in matters of LGBTQ discrimination. It says that the ministerial exception, which applies to all of us under the First Amendment, applies to generally applicable non-discrimination ordinances. Lastly, I do just want to say to folks who think that this ordinance is not needed because, hey, things are pretty peaceful here. To not pass this ordinance means to maintain the status quo. And I think as the mayor or the solicitor mentioned, the status quo currently in this country and in Ohio, we do not have a state law nor a federal law on the books to protect the LGBTQ community from matters of non-discrimination. And so to folks in the community who think that discrimination is not happening because they themselves have not personally heard of it, that is frankly just not true. And we are glad that this ordinance now exists to disrupt that status quo, to protect your community members and visitors and employers and employees, and provide them with a legal remedy. So again, just thank you all for convening this in the circus tent tonight, and we urge you to vote to put it on the ballot. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to comment on an email that came in about 40 minutes after we got started here. I'm not going to have it read into the record. It is unclear. It doesn't make a statement as to whether it's in favor of referral or in terms of appeal. And it seems to be inflammatory to me. It's attacking a couple parties directly, and I don't want to set the precedent that we're going to be entering into the record emails that are coming in 2 minutes from now. All right. The last live person I have here is Susan Ramsey. Just go agree to the ballot. Right. So we are ready now for the Zoom comments. I'm going to ask that we flip-flop at this time and have those speaking in favor of referring it to the ballot to go first.
I haven't received anyone register, and I've prompted them several times.
Okay. Does that for both? For
Yes.
repeal as well? So there are no comments from Zoom. All right, that makes things a lot easier. We were worried about technically how we were going to pull that off. Our solicitor is going to make a couple comments before we go into the discussion.
What I want to do is correct something. Jen Scott was very complimentary to say we've read and read and reread and know this ordinance forward, backward, and inside out. But the rabbi was correct, despite the fact that we've held beautiful discussions and debates for a year. He knows my ordinance better than I do. It is $500 and not $1,000 as the civil fine. And that's something I want to point out too. All our choices are here are to repeal it or refer it. The petition is not to disrupt the community. The petition is exercising their constitutional rights for a referendum. It's also exercising the rights that we protect in our charter for someone simply to ask, let the voters decide the issue. We've had, like I said, beautiful discussions, a rabbi and I, multiple rabbis. Judge Hartman, who's sitting over here at the picnic table enjoying the sunshine, has participated in those. So again, we don't want this to be a divisive process. We want this to be a process where we make one of two choices and respect the people who are asking us actually to make that choice. Whether it's to repeal it or refer it, it's a choice.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to suggest that the way we do this is first off to just kind of go around the table here, and starting with Councilperson Ashley Snyder. If you have any questions or if you want to make any comments. Again, the purpose of this discussion, we're meeting as a committee to determine what the recommendation will be to full council. We made the decision a while back here that the committee should be the full council. We're required to have a committee to do this. So the committee will be discussing what the recommendation will be to full council, and then we will adjourn and go immediately into full council mode to see the recommendation and make a vote. So if you would get us started. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for coming out here, and I respect both sides. My opinion is that we've worked on this hard for a long time. Not loud enough? Oh, goodness. All right. Everyone, thanks for coming out. I respect both sides and both of your opinions on the matter. I do think that council has worked hard with all the interested parties to come to, I think, a fair ordinance. And I think that it is best to refer it to the ballot to let the village decide as a whole.
Thank you. Councilman Connect.
Good afternoon, everyone. Tough decision. I've had a lot of conversations. As some of you know, that I've been kind of the constitutionalist as best as I can be with my limited education. I had several moments where I really feel like, you know, this probably has gone far enough, and it should go out to the people as a true democracy. But I also realize we're not a true democracy. We're a republic, and as such, we have elected officials whom we entrust to really look at the issues with more education and more insight and more resource than we can as typical citizens. And I've tried to do that as best I can. I know that each one of these council members and the mayor and Lou, where are you, Lou? Absolutely looked at this and just, there's a lot of hand wringing here, because I think everybody realized, and this is something that I talked about early on in the process, that when I was struggling with it was, you know, people have rights. And when I was a kid, I was in the backyard, I was screaming and hooting and hollering, and the neighbor was getting upset, and thinking I was the smart aleck kid. I said, hey, I got First Amendment rights. And then my father said, well, yeah, but your rights end where others begin. And that stuck with me for a long, long time up until this day. And as I consider this, I look at it and I say, you know what? People's jobs and housing and livelihood and life experience shouldn't be based upon who their partner is, how they choose to live, what their personal life philosophy is, as long as it doesn't hurt other people. I think we all agree on that. So that's where I looked really hard in this ordinance. And I said, look, is it helping people? And I think it does. I think it's needed. I think a lot of this in this ordinance is needed. I think it takes a step too far. I think it infringes upon the religious freedoms of the religious community, and not just the Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Christians, even agnostics or atheists. They may not want somebody in their world that's, you know, a hell-bent, overzealous Christian. So there's a lot of things to consider. And as I talked it through with several people over the past couple of days, you know, I really thought that this is something that we want to pay attention to. We don't want to get into the habit of passing ordinances that erode certain freedoms. We've learned in the past, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, that the more freedoms that we take away, the harder it is to get them back. So I say that there's a path forward. I think there's a path forward in taking this ordinance, making it something that we can all truly work with. We were there at one point. There was discussion, there was a possibility on the table of having a religious exemption in there. And for various reasons, it never came to fruition. I still think that possibility is there. My vote will be there if we have the religious exemption. So given that, I say, why can't we come together? This is a point of inflection for our community, a point of inflection really for our country. You know, we're so divided right now, left, right, center. This is an opportunity for us to kind of get together and say, hey, you know what? There's a little give and take. It's not going to be perfect on both sides. But once we lose a right, it's hard to get them back. You know, the gay, lesbian, LGBT community never even had the rights. So let's give them those rights. Agree? I think we're all there. But let's not take it away from people who want to live the way they want to live too. One group's life philosophy shouldn't trump another group's life philosophy. That's part of what makes America rich and diverse and a place that I want to live. So I would say, let's repeal it. It would take 2 meetings to fix it, and then we could put it back. Thank you.
You, Mr. Knipp, Miss Councilwoman, Ms. Cheney. Sanitize it, please.
I sanitized first.
I'd like to thank everybody for coming out and giving your side of the story of how you believe and all. And I do appreciate listening to everybody. But I've been around a long time. Let's face it, I'm almost 72 years old. I've lived through discrimination. I've seen it. And with everything going on right now in the world, it's getting worse. So because of that, I have very strong views that we need the ordinance and that I think it should go to the ballot and let the people decide. If it fails, we'll look at it again.
Thank you, Ms. Cheney. Councilman Betcher.
Oh.
You're good.
All right. I'll keep this brief. I want to thank Rabbi Monson again for coming out. I know that we've had a lot of discussions through the course of time in this this journey, I guess, is what it's been. And throughout the night, I heard a lot of opinions about finding common ground. And I'm a firm believer in finding that common ground. However, the common ground for a full religious exemption, in my opinion, precludes rights of others still. You know, one of the quotes that I wrote down tonight, that a general exemption solves all the problems. I lived in the city of Cincinnati after their NDO was passed with a general exemption, and it doesn't solve the problems. Having my group of friends and I walking through downtown and having glass bottles and homophobic slurs thrown at us, that problem wasn't solved. I lived in the city of Cincinnati and faced housing discrimination. So I have been a vocal supporter of this ordinance from the very get-go. I appreciate the concern. I appreciate the discourse. I am disappointed that people who were against it, including members of council, didn't come to me and have a frank conversation about this. And I wish we would have had that to find that common ground, because I think that maybe hearing my story a little bit more personally would have been more effective, but that's on me too. So again, I am supporting that we send it to the people, let the people of the village decide to send it to the ballot.
Thank you, Mr. Betcher. Mr. Lanzer, do we have folks that can share by Zoom? We have 2 council members who I mentioned earlier were unable to attend today. So they are attending via Zoom.
No one has requested to speak. I reached out to Mr. Van Harn and Mr. Pradnoff about speaking, and I'm waiting to hear a response. I assume that they do want to speak though.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I did not see your message. Sorry, I will speak, so.
Me as well. Sorry, I didn't see it until just now.
Okay. So you want to start with Roger, Mr. Van Harn? Mr. Van Harn?
I was waiting for Ari to go first because it's by alphabet.
Oh, okay. It's just all my thing.
That's sorry about that. I don't mean to put you on the spot, are you?
No problem. There's obviously there are a lot of feelings on both sides in this issue, and I definitely agree that myself included, I can do more outreach and take up people who want to share their story and listen to that pain and appreciate where they're coming from. I do support an ordinance that obviously an ordinance which reflects the language of the Cincinnati ordinance would be something which does protect the LGBT community and the Jewish community and the wider religious community. I think that there are bad people out there, and no amount of legislation is gonna fix what some bad people do. Obviously, we want to give some teeth, and we want to give some ability for the government organizations and to keep communities together and keep everybody working together. But the reason why I vote for a repeal on this is because I was not present in the third reading. I was not given a vote on that third reading when it went forward. I supported an amendment to provide a full religious exemption, which was a 3-3 tie in the second reading. And the fact that so many people signed this petition in such a short amount of time, it just indicates how contentious this is, how much it pits neighbor against neighbor within the village. It's one thing to say you might not hear about the discrimination and you think it's peaceful. I hear that. I definitely hear that I don't hear about that discrimination because I'm not discriminated for one reason. Other reasons, as we can all potentially see, I don't know if anyone can see my yarmulke sitting on my head. There are certainly other levels of discrimination that I've felt in my life. Went to Wyoming public schools and felt discrimination there. It's a problem that they have. I support non-discrimination. But I think we can do better, and I think we must do better. I came at the end of this process, and I'm committed to working together with all parties involved to find that common ground. You've heard from Black, white, Jewish, Catholic, gay, and straight people that this ordinance, the way that it is now, is not going to solve the issues, and it's going to create more contention. Ultimately, I think the best thing for us to do is to take a step back and, whether it means spending more time on it and discussing it more as a council, maybe with less outside interference. I don't know. I don't know if that's something even possible. I just don't think that this ordinance, the way that it is adequate. I think we should repeal it, and I think we should work together, and I think we can do better. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pridenoff. Mr. Van Horn.
Thank you. Can you hear me, first of all?
Yes.
Okay. Honestly, I came tonight, I prepared myself to say, to come as a blank slate again. I really appreciate and want to listen to all sides of this and many people. I really, from discussions earlier with other council members, I didn't know which way I was going to go because I see the importance and the value in just letting the residents decide, because I'm weary, I'm tired. This has been a very long process, challenging but rewarding at the same time. And I'll say it again, it's in my heart to always be trying to be a peacemaker, always trying to be building a bridge. And if I could draw a picture, I've been walking back and forth across that bridge trying to figure out how to do that. I do see the necessity, obviously, of the protection for the LGBT community. There's no doubt in my mind, the stories that I've heard, I've experienced it from the outside and different things in my own family and different things. So obviously I do see that. But I also, being a man of faith and a son of a pastor, I do see from an inside view of religious freedom and how it actually does work within a church. There is a lot of misconceptions, I believe, about how people of faith actually do view this. There's actually exchange that I can't explain, and I feel misrepresented many times in that respect. One thing that really has bothered me is always reference to the janitor with this, because in my communities that I was always raised in, we are all equal. And it was not by status of job, it was not by status, and you are all part of the community. And to me, janitors were teachers. The people that I befriended, they were scolding me, they were teaching, they were as much a teacher of principles of how we behave as a community. And one of the things we talk about is admonishing each other to make each other better. So if you did do something against someone else, I was often the one to say, no, don't treat them that way, or the other way around. As we grew up, that's the way the community works. It had nothing to do with you being a janitor. To me, that's almost reverse discrimination, and it's planting a seed in religion that is not what I've experienced. From discussion with the Jewish community, I don't believe they view that way either. So I don't really know where that comes from. I've been really, really impressed with all the comments tonight on both sides. And the thing I really appreciated from, actually, I heard it on both sides as people talked, was taking a step back. And I think that's tonight what I'm advocating for in repeal, but I want to qualify this. I've asked Terry, I've tried very hard to say, is there a way we can actually stumble forward where we can repeal this? And I will volunteer to bring it back, reintroduce it as legislation. I love that Lou said he has to fight for it, but Lou, you don't have to fight for it. I will join you in trying to bring this back and adjust it a little bit. And it doesn't have to go through this process. And I think it will be a unifying event for our village if we just keep pushing through forward. Sometimes the hardest thing is that last part of the threshold, and the best thing comes right after that. And I also want to make sure we don't mischaracterize this repeal idea as trashing it. I think that's inappropriate, and I really think, and I want to make sure it's clear that my vote to repeal it is not about trashing it, it is about taking the step back. I think we can continue, and I will join Matt, I will join Lou, I'll join all those people, and let's take it one step further. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Van Horn.
That's it.
All right. All right. So at this point, I believe what we're doing is we're going to call a vote of what the recommendation to the full council will be. Is that correct, Mr. Solicitor?
Yes. Can you hear me now? Oh.
Yes, Senator,
Okay.
we can hear you.
Typical of Mr. Roberts and his rules of order, we need a motion from any member of the committee who wants to initiate a motion for the next step. One motion being to repeal it, one motion being to refer it. And then a vote, probably a roll call vote on that.
Make a motion to refer it to the ballot.
I'll second it.
And then a roll call vote on that unless there's further discussion.
We're discussed out for now. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Betcher,
Yes.
Ms. Cheney,
Yes.
Mr. Knipp,
No.
Mr. Pridenoff,
No.
Ms. Snyder,
Yes.
Mr. Van Horn.
No.
3-3.
Vote is 3-3.
Before we go any further, again, Mr. Roberts and his rules of order, we are sitting as a council committee. I'm assuming a second motion would also result in a 3-3 tie. The mayor does not break a tie in a committee because he is not a member of council as a whole as a committee. He is the convener for the meeting tonight. So we would simply come forward with no recommendation and then go into our legislative session where we do have to have legislation. We either have to have legislation repealing the ordinance or legislation referring the ordinance. And in that capacity, the mayor can vote if there is a tie. Do you want to put a second motion on there?
Is there a
Just to
motion?
confirm 3-3 again?
Right. I have a motion to adjourn. Second. All in
And then
favor?
we're going forward then without a specific recommendation from the committee, but we will now go into our special meeting of council on the adjournment unless there's a 2-3 minute break anybody needs.
Anyone? All right, so we have a motion to adjourn.
We have a
and-
motion and a second.
And a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Without objection, I'll take that as unanimous. And without a request for a break, I will convene this full council meeting on the topic of legislation to either refer this to the ballot or to repeal it. And I will once again go around for any final comments, unless you feel there's a different way to proceed.
Well, again, we need to put this on the table, what our legislation would be, and there are alternate pieces of legislation. One is an ordinance repealing it and declaring an emergency. Because if we're going to trump an ordinance with an ordinance, I don't know that you want to go through this 3 different times. So the next one is a resolution to refer it to the November ballot. So is there a preference as to which one you want to advance first in the vote?
Make a motion for a resolution to refer it to the ballot.
This is strictly a procedure motion, folks. It's not necessarily I'm in favor of or against it.
I'll second it.
Do we do a roll call vote or a voice vote to just start with that ordinance?
There's room for comment before we do a roll call. And in that capacity, I would clarify what as council members, we're all familiar with passing this as an emergency, what that means. It means that we don't have to do this for 2 more council meetings. All right, the same procedure for 2 more council meetings. Just to clarify that, if anybody was wondering what that meant.
So procedurally, we have a motion on the floor now as council to read resolution number 2020-9 and its process. Do you want to put that on the agenda first and go through the reading and the vote on that resolution? We need a vote from council. How do you want to proceed?
We have a motion to refer to the November ballot by Mr. Betcher and a second by Ms. Cheney.
All it is a motion to read that resolution first.
Okay.
Does it need to be read in its entirety?
Yes, our charter allows us to read by title only if it was available in advance of the meeting for public review. Given the fact we didn't know until 30 seconds ago which piece of legislation would advance, we'll have to read either or both of them in their entirety. Don't be afraid. This is an attachment of the other ordinance, so we're not going to be here for an hour going through 25 pages of legislation. But we need council to make a decision. How do you want to go forward right now with the process of reading one first? And motion right now is to read first the resolution to refer this to the ballot.
Is there any objection to the process? Right.
So everybody's in favor of being that one first? All right. This is resolution number 2020-9, a resolution referring ordinance 2019-10 entitled an ordinance to combat discrimination and for the guarantee of equality and inclusion to the November 2020 general election for approval or rejection. Whereas council did enact ordinance number 2019-10 entitled an ordinance to combat discrimination and for the guarantee of equality and inclusion on January 27, 2020, a copy of which is attached here too. Whereas subsequent to the adoption of the ordinance, a referendum petition was circulated throughout the community, asking the ordinance to be submitted to the electorate of the Village of Golf Manor for approval or rejection, consistent with the charter of the Village of Golf Manor and the laws of the state of Ohio. And whereas the Hamilton County Board of Elections previously did determine that there were a sufficient number of signatures on such a petition to satisfy the minimum requirements for the matter to be submitted to council to either revoke such ordinance or refer it to the general election ballot. Whereas council previously did make a determination that based upon information from the Board of Elections, the petition was valid and sufficient, and council did set the matter consistent with the charter of the Village of Golf Manor for public hearing before council as a committee of the whole, which public hearing was held July 14, 2020. Whereas council as a committee of the whole at the conclusion of the public hearing made no recommendation concerning the referral of this matter to the general election. Now therefore be it resolved by the Council of the Village of Gulf Manor, Hamilton County, Ohio, that council does accept the, well, we can't say accept the recommendation. Council committee as a whole does hereby refer ordinance 2019-10 entitled an ordinance to combat discrimination and for the guarantee of equality and inclusion to the Hamilton County Board of Elections to place a question on the ballot to be voted upon at the general election scheduled November 3, 2020 to determine whether or not this ordinance should be approved or rejected. Section 2 is proposed that the condensed text of the ordinance read: the ordinance prohibits housing discrimination, discriminatory practices relating to employment, discriminatory practices relating to public accommodations, and discriminatory practices relating to educational institutions for protected classes such as age, race, color, religion, ethnicity, national origin, ancestry, disability, marital status, family status, military status, sex, gender identity or expression, or sexual orientation. The ordinance establishes a Human Rights Commission within the village and grants authority to the Human Rights Commission to receive complaints for violation of the ordinance and the authority to investigate, reconcile, or adjudicate those complaints, including the right to assess a civil penalty not to exceed $500. Certain exemptions are recognized within the ordinance as applies to religious or denominational corporations, institutions, or associations. It is proposed that a full text of the ordinance be available and posted at each polling place within the village. Section 3, the specific ballot language to be approved by the Hamilton County Board of Elections is suggested to read: shall ordinance number 2019-10 entitled an ordinance to combat discrimination and for the guarantee of equality and inclusion be approved. If supported by a majority of affirmative votes, the ordinance shall remain as enacted. Section 4, the village fiscal officer serving as clerk shall take additional action as may be required to refer the matter to the Hamilton County Board of Elections to get added to the November 3, 2020 general election ballot. The result of such election shall then be certified to the village to approve ordinance 2019-10 as adopted or to reject and repeal such legislation consistent with the determination of the majority of the voters in the village of Gulf Manor voting thereon. Section 5, this resolution shall take effect the earliest opportunity as allowable by law. And I will point out that the text that I'm reading, I corrected along the way that it was not $1,000, it was $500. And I corrected along the way that there was no recommendation. So as read, we need a motion to approve, a second, and a roll call vote.
Motion to approve.
I'll second.
And there could be further question or debate. Again, Mr. Robertson is rules.
Should this remain a tie and I'm called on determining whether this is going to go to the ballot or not, I will have a couple comments before I make my decision. Roll call.
Mr. Betcher,
Yes.
Ms. Cheney,
Yes.
Mr. Knet,
No.
Mr. Priednoff,
No.
Ms. Snyder,
Yes.
Mr. Van Horn,
You're muted, Mr. Van Horn.
Mr. Van Ham.
Sorry, no.
3-3.
All right, so this isn't the first time that I've been in this position. We've been talking through revisions of this as has been commented on for a couple of years now. I am one of the things that I'm most proud of about this legislation is that it allows anyone who feels like they're being discriminated against to have a place locally where they can go to get resources and information to help them with that. All right. And I don't think that anyone's in disagreement about that piece. I'm very proud that Gulf Manor is unified on that. We need something like this, that it's very helpful to maintaining the peace of the community. Another part of this that I've been immensely proud of is the process that we followed going through to the point that we are today. We literally went line by line. Now, I think our attorney has alluded to how thick this legislation is. All right, many pages. We literally went line by line. He mentioned the amendments, the changes that we had in that process. How we did this is we had people speaking on behalf of what turned out to be a very common two-sided piece of this. We had representation from Equality Ohio, and we had representation from the rabbis of the Jewish community, representing the Orthodox Jewish community here. All right. So we went line by line and amended it as we went in ways that were, my recollection of it, and I was here for the full process of it, was that we amended it in ways that it was agreeable to everyone going all the way through. There was portions where we were asked to just grant a full exemption, all right, for the way Cincinnati did. My take on that was that that actually would roll back some of the protections that that folks had, all right? That a full exemption would mean things like, well, if a religious organization wanted to have public housing, all right, that was open to the public, that they could decide who was going to be allowed into that housing, all right, that a full exemption would allow that. I could be wrong, but that was my take listening to the legal counsel on this, that a full exemption actually rolled back stuff or was an attempt to roll back stuff that we had already decided that, well, no, there's certain things, if you're going to be in the public place for commerce, all right, everyone's equal, all right? These protected classes are protected when you're in the public area of commerce. If you're going to do something where beforehand you're saying, no, we're only having this bake sale for the folks at our church or at our synagogue, then yeah, you're exempted, all right? You can determine who's coming in and who's not. But as soon as you say, hey, everybody, come on in to our bake sale, you can't then say, except for you, all right? And I believe our legislation says that very clearly. I'm very proud of, as I said, the process that we went through to get there. Having said all that, no legislation is perfect. And I think I should speak to how we could make this better. I don't believe that, as someone said, the quickest way possible, they didn't say the quickest way possible. I want the quickest way possible of how to make this better. That the quickest way possible would be to just say, let's repeal this and start over from the beginning, all right? Again, it requires 3 readings. We'd have to come up again with legislation, likely going line by line, which, by the way, I want to say on to that point, I'm very proud that all voices were heard in this process and that we maintained a civil discourse through this. I know that it was difficult and at times, compared to the rest of the world, this was a civil process. And I'm very proud of that, very proud of our community on that. I believe the quickest way forward for any kind of amendments to this is to send it to the ballot, let the voters vote on it. If it's agreed to, then like any legislation or any ordinance that's passed by any municipal body, it's open to tweaking as we go along. And we can say this line, you know, someone can put forth a motion that says this line, we don't like this line in the legislation. We'd rather it say this. We can do that. Now, I feel like we've already done that for 2 years, all right? But I believe that's the quickest way to resolving some of the remaining issues that council persons feel are legitimate, all right? So with that said, I say let it go to the ballot.
Before we close, we could entertain a motion if someone wanted us to then read the other ordinance to repeal it. It's an option still. The effect of this tonight is this would go, if it's passed right now, to the Board of Elections. The actual language on the ballot is up to the Board of Elections. We only make suggestions. So the Board of Elections ultimately will make that determination as to how this is to read on the ballot. And then the ordinance is still stayed. The ordinance will not take effect until determination is made at the November election. If a majority of folks are in support of keeping the ordinance, it will then go into effect when the election is certified. So there's nothing in place right now. If it is repealed, then it stops in its tracks. I want to make sure everybody is aware of that. And I want to make sure, again, that we're correct. And Rabbi, again, it is $500 civil penalty. It is not a not to exceed. And I hope that I read that correctly. Did I read it correctly as I corrected it?
500 a day.
Well, language is a civil penalty of $500. is a
So
summary.
it does not say to exceed.
Correct.
Not to exceed. So
If anyone is confused on that, we could make a quick motion to amend and vote on it again. Or if we're acceptive of that language, and it's all again, it's just a language.
$500 a day for the.
Our ordinance does say $500 each day a violation occurs. It can be assessed that way.
each day a violation occurs. So if a violation occurred and someone was, you know, bringing that to our attention, but it wasn't something that was happening every day, then it would just be that one $500. But I was concerned when I first, it's not going to change my vote. It just actually supports the idea that the fastest way we can bring this to be addressed further is to take it to the ballot.
So again, that language is correct. Do we need to amend the text in any way or vote
I
again
would
on
take
it?
a not to exceed clause.
Take out the not to exceed clause.
My understanding is we weren't allowed to amend anything now.
No,
correct?
no, no. What I'm talking about is this piece of legislation in the ballot language itself, the summary that we would provide to the Board of Elections. Am I correct that the summary you want provided to the Board of Elections says a $500 civil penalty?
It should, my understanding is that it should accurately reflect what the legislation is. We shouldn't be changing it into saying that it's something that it's not. I don't think that I agree with that part of the legislation, but to your point, I think it should stay as it is.
Do you, again, do you want this? This is only the summary language that goes to the Board of Elections. Do you want that summary language on the $500 to say a civil penalty of $500 or a civil penalty of $500 up to each day being a violation? What would your preference be?
I agree with Stefan that it should be what the ordinance is. We can't be changing it if, and now that I want to make sure I know what the ordinance actually says before I can actually have an exact opinion on this, but whatever it says is what should be in the ballot.
So I'm going to ask for a motion then to make sure that we have correct language on the ballot referral. And will someone make a motion then to write to assess a civil penalty of $500? Is that the motion? Or is there a motion of a civil
I make a
penalty?
motion that it should say $500 a day as it is in the ordinance.
A day of, each day of violation is what it says in the ordinance.
I'll second it.
Day of continuing, yeah, right. Not all violations are continuous violations, so.
The ordinance says each day on which a continuing violation occurs shall constitute a new and separate violation of this chapter. Do you want that language specifically in the summary that goes to the ballot? And I'm hearing a motion to correct that in this ballot language to move it forward.
Is there a second? Is everyone clear on what they would be seconding, or do we need a?
I would need an
clarification?
explanation just for the sake of the minute.
For the record, one more clarification of what the motion is, what the wording to, so the motion is to submit a certain wording to what the summary of our legislation says, all right? So concerning what that summary is, there's been a motion that the summary specific to the part about the $500 fine would read as.
The sentence right now in the ordinance says the ordinance from the summary, I'm reading the summary. The ordinance establishes a Human Rights Commission within the village and grants authority to the Human Rights Commission to receive complaints for violation of the ordinance and the authority to investigate, reconcile, or adjudicate those complaints, including the right to assess a civil penalty of $500. Do you want it to say of $500, or do you want to say of $500 and each day shall be considered a separate violation?
I stand by my original motion.
Can you repeat it, please?
My motion is that we should amend the summary to reflect what the actual legislation says, which is that it is the ordinance includes a $500 fine per day of the suspected violation.
The language of the ordinance says each day on which a continuing violation occurs shall constitute a new and separate violation. Is that the language, Mr. Britnoff, that you're asking to be added
Yes.
to the summary for the ballot?
I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you for that clarification. Yes, that is what I would like to add.
And is there a second on that motion to make that amendment, and then we will revote this resolution?
We have a second.
Roll call vote? I would think a roll call vote would be appropriate. And remember, you're advocating now that this ordinance be amended, this resolution, I'm sorry, be amended to reflect that language and be referred.
Again, what we are amending is the summary of the legislation that we're taking to the voters. We're not changing the legislation. We're changing the summary to make it more accurate.
So let's vote first on the motion, Mr. Roberts and his rules.
I believe we have a first and a second for roll call.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Are you, Terry, are you saying that I'm voting to refer or I'm voting to change the summary?
You're voting simply to make an amendment to that summary right
Okay,
now.
that's what I thought. But yeah, okay, thank you. I'm not changing my original vote.
So you're making a motion to amend. Do we have everyone in agreement or majority in agreement to make that amendment? Roll call vote.
Mr. Betcher.
Yes.
Ms. Cheney.
Yes.
Mr. Knipp.
Yes.
Mr. Priednoff.
Yes?
Ms. Snyder.
Yes.
Mr. Van Horn.
Yes.
And then to clarify our record, I want to ask for a vote to now approve the resolution as amended to go forward.
Do we have a motion?
So moved.
A second. Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Betcher.
Yes.
Ms. Cheney.
Yes.
Mr. Knipp.
Yes.
Mr. Priednoff.
No.
Ms. Snyder.
Yes.
Mr. Van Horn.
No.
Motion
And
carries.
I think
I have a
for
record of 4
Mr.
to
Knipp's
2.
benefit, he's indicating that as amended, it will go forward. Maybe he's recognizing the vote may still be 3-3 with the mayor voting the tie, but you still stand by the position that you want this repealed.
I think I misunderstood something.
I have
You want
a,
to change your vote to,
I thought we changed,
you want to change your vote then to no on it as amended?
I thought to be clear, we were voting on whether Mr. Priednoff's amendment.
We did that vote.
Right.
Now
So- Oh, I see what we're doing now. Yes.
so I have,
We're bringing back on the table that amended resolution to go forward. Since there was confusion in that vote, can the clerk recall the roll?
Democracy.
yeah. So I have a motion to approve the resolution as amended
Correct.
for referral to the fall ballot by Mr. Betcher and a second by Ms. Snyder. Roll call vote. Mr. Betcher.
Yes.
Ms. Cheney.
Yes.
Mr. Knipp.
No.
Mr. Priednoff.
No.
Ms. Snyder.
Yes.
Mr. Van Horn.
No.
3-3.
And for the reasons I stated earlier, yes.
So we will clean up that language. We will then deliver this to the Board of Elections. The ordinance itself, again, is still stayed pending the outcome of the general election. And again, we can make all the recommendations we want on that ballot language. It's up to the Board of Elections to determine what the ballot language should be. If there's any further business,
Thank you, everyone, for coming out. Do I have a motion for adjourn?
So motioned?
There's a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Without objection, I take that as unanimous. Thank you, everyone, for participating in your local democracy.
I don't think I did. I caught myself like.
Good job, Andy.